In every city, there are stories that never made the papers. Not because they weren't important, but because they were inconvenient. They live in forgotten files, in half-finished investigations, in questions no one wanted answered. This isn't where justice always wins. This is where the echoes remain. This is Reverberating Noir. There's a road in County Galway that looks like any other road in the west of Ireland. Stone walls, damp fields, the kind of silence that feels older than memory. And on a Sunday morning in the summer of 1882, that silence was broken by rifle fire. By the time the smoke cleared, 2 men were dead. A horse was running blind toward town, and a wall of silence had already begun to form around whoever pulled those triggers. A wall that has never come down.
Welcome to Reverberating Noir. I'm Nina Jovovich.
And I'm Adam Jones. Tonight we're going to County Galway, Ireland, to a case that most people have never heard of, and to a question that still doesn't have an answer. Who killed John Henry Blake on the 29th of June, 1882, and why does the silence around that question feel so deliberate?
Before we get to the killing itself, we need to understand what Ireland was in 1882, because this case doesn't make sense without that context. And once you understand that context, the killing starts to feel almost inevitable, which is the most disturbing part.
Ireland in the early 1800s was a country being slowly consumed, not by war, not by plague, by paperwork. By rent, books and eviction notices and the quiet violence of a system designed to extract everything from the people who worked the land and return nothing.
The structure was simple and brutal. Tenant farmers worked land they didn't own. Land owned, in many cases, by men who had never set foot in Ireland, who lived in London townhouses and collected income from estates they couldn't have found on a map. The Marquess of Clanricarde is the clearest example of this. He owned 52,000 acres in County Galway. He drew roughly £25,000 a year from that land. He never once visited it.
He lived in a suite at the Albany off Piccadilly, surrounded by art, while families in Galway lived in mud cabins and hoped the potato crop wouldn't fail again. And if it did fail and they fell behind on rent, he sent someone to remove them.
That someone, by 1882, was John Henry Blake, Clanricarde's land agent, the man on the ground, the face of the machine.
And here's what makes Blake's story complicated. He wasn't an outsider. He wasn't some English administrator sent over to manage the Irish. He was from Galway, one of the old tribes of Galway, in fact, families who had been in the region for centuries. Born in 1808, the youngest son of a lieutenant colonel, he'd managed his own lands, owned over 2,000 acres in the county himself, lived at Rathville House. He was local, he was known, and he was still the face of everything tenants were fighting against.
Contemporary accounts of Blake are completely contradictory, and I think that contradiction matters. The Spectator described him as generally liked. Local folklore from the Athenry archives describes him as cruel and ruthless. Both things may have been true. That's what makes him so difficult to place in this story. He wasn't a villain imported from elsewhere. He was a local man who had become the instrument of a distant landlord's policies. And that proximity, that familiarity, made him more visible, more reachable.
When you can't get to the man at the top, you get to the man in the middle.
By 1882, the land war had been building for years. The Irish National Land League had organized mass protests, collective refusals to pay rent, boycotts, the word itself was coined during this period, named after a particularly harsh estate agent named Charles Boycott. Hundreds of thousands of people were involved. Michael Davitt reportedly drew crowds of 200,000, and still the evictions continued. Still the rents stayed high. Still, families were thrown out of homes they'd worked for generations, their doors and roofs literally carted away.
There's an image that keeps coming back to me when I think about this period. Women sitting on the rubble of their destroyed homes, singing, not because it helped, but because it was the only thing left to do.
When peaceful methods fail repeatedly, some people conclude that more extreme measures are necessary. That's not a justification, it's a pattern. And it's one we see in almost every prolonged conflict between power and resistance. By 1882, that pattern had reached its logical and terrible conclusion.
The summer of 1882 was already soaked in blood before Blake's murder. Just 2 weeks before, a man named Walter Burke and a police corporal named Wallace had been shot dead near Gore, not far away in Galway. And less than 2 months before that, May of 1882, the Phoenix Park murders. The newly appointed Chief Secretary for Ireland and his aide stabbed to death in broad daylight in Dublin. Ireland wasn't just tense, it was unraveling.
So when we say Blake's murder was calculated, we mean it precisely. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. Someone planned it. Someone surveyed that road. Someone cut loopholes in a stone wall half a mile from Loughrea town. Someone positioned riflemen behind that wall before dawn on a Sunday morning. And someone knew that John Henry Blake would be on that road, in that trap, heading to Mass.
The 29th of June 1882. A Sunday. The sun climbing over County Galway. Birds in the hedgerows. Blake and his wife in the trap. His driver, Thady Ruane, handling the horse. Half a mile from town. The shots came through the loopholes in the wall. Multiple rounds, fired with discipline. Blake and Ruane were killed almost immediately. The horse bolted. Mrs. Blake held on. By the time someone in Loughrea stopped that runaway trap, John Henry Blake was already gone.
What strikes me about the mechanics of this attack is how much preparation it required. The loopholes in the wall weren't improvised. They were made in advance. That means someone spent time, probably the night before, possibly earlier, cutting firing positions into a stone wall on a public road, and no one reported it. Or if they did, nothing came of it.
That's the silence I keep coming back to. Not just after the killing, before it. The preparation for this attack didn't happen invisibly. Someone knew, possibly several people knew, and the silence held.
A massive investigation followed. The British authorities were not indifferent to the murder of a land agent in 1882. These killings were politically significant. They threatened the entire apparatus of land management in Ireland. And still, no one was ever charged, no one was ever brought to justice. The killers, as far as the historical record shows, simply went home.
Back to their farms, back to their families, back to Sunday Mass, perhaps, the following week. And the community closed around them like water closing over a stone.
This is one of the most psychologically significant aspects of the land war killings. The wall of silence wasn't coerced in every case in many communities. It was genuinely collective. People didn't protect the killers out of fear alone. They protected them because they understood why it had happened. That's a different kind of silence, and it's a much harder one to break.
Now, here's the part of this story that should stop you cold. Clanricarde's response to the murder of his land agent, a man who had worked for him loyally, who had been killed on a Sunday morning heading to church, was to say, and I want to be precise here, my tenants need not think they will intimidate me by murdering my agent or bailiffs.
He didn't grieve. He didn't reflect. He didn't ask whether his policies had contributed to what happened. He doubled down. He continued his eviction campaigns well into the late 1800s, sometimes requiring hundreds of police officers to remove single families from their homes. Blake's death changed nothing for Clanricarde. If anything, it made him harder.
And that's the maddening paradox at the centre of this case. The killing was meant to send a message. The message was received, and the response was to escalate.
This is a pattern we see repeatedly in cases where political violence is used as a tool of coercion against entrenched power. It rarely works the way its perpetrators intend. The killing of Blake didn't bring Clanricarde to the negotiating table. It gave him a justification for further repression. 2 men died on that road. Thady Ruane, Blake's driver, is often forgotten entirely a man who was simply doing his job and was killed in someone else's war. Mrs. Blake survived physically. What she carried after that morning, we can only imagine. And Clanricarde, safe in London, barely flinched.
He kept collecting, he kept evicting. He kept living in his Albany suite, dressed in shabby clothes that apparently didn't reflect his wealth, hoarding art, refusing to spend a penny on the land that fed him. There's something almost theatrical about a man that committed to his own cruelty.
What finally broke the system wasn't a single act of violence. It was the slow, grinding accumulation of moral and political pressure over decades. By 1909, the situation had become so untenable that the British government passed land legislation specifically designed to enable the compulsory purchase of estates like Clanricarde's. They had to create new law just to deal with landlords who were that intractable. Clanricarde fought it in court for 6 years. In 1915, the Congested Districts Board finally acquired his land. Tenants were allowed to buy their holdings. The system he had defended so ruthlessly for so long was dismantled, not by rifles through a stone wall, by legislation.
He died in 1916, unmarried, in London. His estate was probated at £2.5 million. He was buried in an unmarked grave on the west side of Highgate Cemetery. In Ireland, his name survived him as a synonym for landlord cruelty. In England, he was barely a footnote.
And John Henry Blake's killers? Still unknown, still unidentified. Still, in some sense, protected by that wall of silence that formed around them on the morning of the 29th of June, 1882.
What I keep returning to what I can't let go of is the question of what Blake himself understood about his position. He was a local man. He knew these communities. He'd lived among them. He knew what eviction meant. He'd seen the rubble. He'd heard the singing. Did he believe in what he was doing? Did he think he had no choice? Did he understand on some level what he was becoming?
History doesn't give us that answer. And I think that's deliberate, not in the sense that someone suppressed it, but in the sense that it was never a question anyone thought to ask while he was alive. He was a function, an instrument. The man who collected the rents, the man who served the notices, his inner life wasn't part of the record anyone was keeping.
That's what systems do. They reduce people to their function. Clanricarde was reduced to his income. Blake was reduced to his role. The tenants were reduced to their arrears. And when people are reduced to functions, it becomes very easy to treat them as expendable.
The distance is what enables it. Clanricarde could be as ruthless as he was because he never had to look at what his ruthlessness produced. He collected his rents through agents. He issued his orders through intermediaries. The suffering was always somewhere else. Always mediated, always abstract. That's not a feature unique to 19th century Irish landlordism. That's a structural vulnerability that exists in any system where decision-makers are insulated from consequences.
And Blake, whether he deserved what happened to him or not, was the point where that insulation became visible. He was the face of the machine, the human cost of a system that had no human face at the top, and so the machine's face was the one that suffered.
The thing that stays with me about this case is the completeness of the impunity. Not just that the killers were never caught that happens. Investigations fail. Evidence disappears. Witnesses don't come forward. But there's something different about a silence this total, this sustained, this apparently voluntary. The community didn't just fail to identify the killers. The community decided not to. And that decision held for over 140 years.
If you've stayed with us this far, thank you. This is what we do at Reverberating Noir. We sit with the cases that don't resolve, the stories that don't end cleanly, the questions that stay open long after everyone involved is gone. If that's the kind of storytelling you want more of, subscribe to Reverberating Noir. We're here every week. And we're not going anywhere. That road outside Loughrea is still there. The stone walls are still standing. Somewhere in one of them, perhaps, are the loopholes that were cut the night before a Sunday morning in 1882. Filled in now, maybe. Overgrown. But the stone remembers the shape of what was cut into it. Stone always does. John Henry Blake is buried somewhere in County Galway. Thady Ruane, too. Mrs. Blake outlived that morning by years, carrying whatever she carried. And the men who fired those shots went home, lived their lives. Died in their beds, in all likelihood. With the silence intact around them, like a second skin. There are places in the world where justice was never the point, where what mattered was survival, and where the community decided, collectively and quietly, that some things would stay buried. I understand why they made that choice. I'm not sure I can say it was wrong, but I keep thinking about that horse, running blind toward Loughrea, carrying what it couldn't understand. Some things keep running long after the people involved are gone, long after the road has changed, long after the silence has hardened into history.
No one was ever charged with the murders of John Henry Blake and Thady Ruane. The investigation closed. The files were kept. And somewhere in the historical record, there is almost certainly a name, possibly more than one that was known at the time and was never spoken aloud to the authorities. The silence wasn't an absence of knowledge, it was a decision. And decisions like that don't just protect killers. They shape what a community believes justice is allowed to mean. That shaping doesn't end when the case closes. It echoes.
The recording ends here, but the case doesn't. Somewhere, the evidence still exists. The questions still wait. If this story stayed with you, if it followed you into the silence, subscribe to Reverberating Noir. Not for us, for the stories that refuse to disappear.
Because as long as something doesn't make sense, the truth is still out there. And someone will find it.
Until next time, keep listening to the dark.